Greetings, everyone. This is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever, and today's video is going to be called Lost in Translation, How Not to Read a Text. So recently I was on a forum, which I'm basically getting off of at this point, and a Christian wrote to me recently stating the following. What he stated was during a discussion where I was trying to explain to Christians, for example, that they have different standards than Torath Mosheh and Orthodox Jews do, and that essentially that there's no real debate with it, and that the New Testament, just doesn't meet the standards of Torath Mosheh, and just basically to say why, and say what things would have been required to even have a Jew who follows Torath Mosheh even like consider the text, which of course would be a lot of things, which I won't really get into in this video. So one of the particular Christians who responded to that particular post, and it seemed like many of them didn't want to accept the fact that Jews who hold by Torath Mosheh just have a different standard, and that we're not trying to convince them of our standard. It's more like they're trying to convince us of their standard, which is something we don't go by. So one of them wrote to me and says, after an initial posting of other things, he says, as for what God says about Judah and Ephraim, basically he's trying to say about Jews of old, Jews of current, and Jews of future, they will be crushed in judgment. And he tries to quote Hosea 5:11 through 12 until they acknowledge their guilt. Hosea 5 through 16, and at that time they will be healed, but not until after 2 days, which he claims is 2,000 years. Hosea 6:2. The question is 2 days after what day? Now, the basic problem with this is that whatever he's got in his mind as a concept is really a bad idea. And it brings up something I've been, I think, trying to get at to people who are on this forum. And I think, it's probably better for me to leave the forum and just do videos about it. And that bad idea is the following. Problem number one, aren't books read from start to finish? One of the things that sometimes I've gotten messages from Christians on is that they pull out like verses of like the English Christian Bible, and it's like they always find some place in the middle, somewhere in the end, but they never like say, okay, from start to finish, this is what it says. And my, objection to that is, hey, think about it. That doesn't make any sense. You always start a book from like start to finish, and then you make a decision about what it says. Problem number two is don't I need the full context to understand something written in the middle of the book? Meaning that don't I need to know who the author is? Don't I need to know something about what the person was writing about? What were the circumstances? I mean, that seems like the obvious to me, but maybe it's not so obvious in these situations. But in that I just have to say, hey, think about it. Next, the problem number three is it possible that I have an agenda when I focus on one or two sentences in a book while ignoring the context of what comes before and after it? Meaning that if I somehow have gotten to like, the 15th chapter of like a 30 chapter book and start making statements about something, so may I ask, okay, what happened to like the first, 14 chapters? What happens to the chapters after? Why are you focusing on chapter 15 all of a sudden? Let's go back over that. In some cases you get like, no, 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 this is all there is. You don't need to know anything else. And in some cases, they don't even know there's like, it's almost like there's no other part of the book. So to that, I would have to say, think about it. Then problem number four, isn't a translation inferior to the original in the language it was originally written in? Meaning, for example, if someone were to like be in China and say that they have a correct understanding of the Declaration of Independence of America, but the person in China only knows it in Chinese, has never like heard it in English, never read it in English, and has never been to America to experience it and understand it for themselves, but they claim to be an expert in Chinese. Well, isn't the original like more, like superior to the inferior translation? To that again, I could go on days for that, but to that I would just say, think about it. Now, let me just show you how this is really done, especially in terms of Torath Moshe. There is essentially there is a need for me to go back over exactly what Torath Mosheh is. So Torath Mosheh, as I've mentioned in several videos, is all ancient, authoritative, and authentic historical text, concepts, judicial rulings, practice, and traditions that trace directly back to the singularity of the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai, as it was transmitted from Hashem to Moshe ben Amram and all of Am Yisrael, the people of Israel, and has been preserved by their descendants who are from the most ancient communities of Mizrahi, Taimani, Sfaradi, and Maghrebi and Ashkenazi Jews. So that is pretty clear, and I think I've covered it to describe what exactly it means in other videos. So when it comes to Torath Mosheh Jews, we have this very exclusive and ancient technique when it comes to reading a text. And that methodology is that essentially we take a text, start from the very beginning, work our way through it bit by bit until we get to the very, 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 very end of the book. And only then do we go back and try to make decisions about everything we just read. And in many cases, we'll read that book over and over and over and over again until the day we die. That's the most ancient and authentic technique of Torath Mosheh. We read a book from start to finish, and only after we've done that at least several times do we make a decision. So then this brings up the issue of what the original questioner was asking about, and that is the book of Hosea, which in Hebrew, Hosea is known as Hosea ben Be'eri. So essentially what this means is that Hoshea ben Be'eri was a prophet who was from the tribe of Reuven. He lived in the northern kingdom of Israel after the time it had split off from the king of Judah in the south. His focus was on the corruption of the northern kingdom, which was under the rule of Yoravam ben Yoash, with some focus on Yehuda, which was ruled by a succession of kings from Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Yahiziah. His prophecies basically discussed the corruption against the Torah of the time, yet he wrote that the solution was turning back to the Torah. This is very important because you can't understand a text unless you understand who it is who was writing it and for what purpose they were even writing the text. Now, one of the things that's interesting about the non-Torah, Torath Moshe based techniques of reading a text is that pretty much every one of them I've seen has kind of been devoid of logic. And here's what I mean by that. When someone just pulls out like a verse or a chapter, it's kind of silly because when you think about it and when you look at like ancient texts, like for example, what I usually present is either from the Aleppo Codex or also from the Tajim from Yemen or any other like ancient text, there were no verse numbers, no chapter numbers. So essentially what you would have to have is a situation where, for example, the part that you see the mouse moving over is the beginning of Sefer Hosea, which we'll go over in just a second in terms of what it actually says. They would essentially have to skip all of this at the beginning and just move their way through the text and and just like say, okay, let me find something that makes a point. Aha, there's something right there. And then just like basically say, let's skip over everything that comes after that one little point I just found somewhere, and I don't need to know anything about what's being talked about here. I don't need to know the context. I don't need to know any of this other stuff that you just said. I just found my one little verse somewhere in a text that has no like markings for verses or chapters, and I'm going to just make my little point and come to my little conclusions and leave it at that. Basically, I think anybody would say that this is devoid of logic, especially since Sefer Hosea, as well as some of the other books from certain prophets, are not actually that long. So for someone to all of a sudden go to the middle of the text and try to make a point out of it is kind of a weird thing and a strange thing, and it also is devoid of logic. Where someone who can explain to you from start to finish what the text is talking about and give you the context under which it's talking about, that's someone who's going to make a lot more sense, as we'll see. So let's think about what makes more sense here. If I go and take the Hebrew text of Hosea, because Hosea obviously wrote it in Hebrew. He didn't write it in Greek. He didn't write anything in English. He didn't write it in those kind of translations. He wrote it in Hebrew. So essentially the text as it starts out, you see there's a kind of area with red brackets there. What it says is the following. Devar Adonai, Devar Hashem, Asher hoyo el Hoshea ben Be'ori בימי עוזיו, יותם, אחוז, יחזקאל, מלכי יהודה, ובני ירבעם ben Yoav, Melech Yisrael, Tihaleth diber Adonai b'Hoshea. So essentially what this first section is talking about is that the first chapter, basically in the first verse, actually says who the audience is. The prophet's words were basically directed during a time when there was a split between the kingdom of Yehuda, which was in the south, or people call it Judah, and Yisrael in the north, meaning that 10 of the tribes basically broke off and started basically their own nation in the north, in the Shomron area, which is mentioned in this text. And then, for example, in the south in Yehuda, there was the kingdom that was the original kingdom, and then had continued. Now the thing is that the reason why this is mentioned is that basically the prophecy of Hosea is essentially for that generation. So of course, also it mentioned in this text that Hosea was the son of Be'eri. So the question comes up, well, why is that even important? Well, first of all, as we mentioned before, it's important to know exactly what time frame he lived in, exactly who his text was directed towards. Because the main thing is that this text was not directed at all Jews. It wasn't directed at all Israelis. It was directly at the governments that he's mentioning here, which was the governments of during the time of Aziyah, Yotham, Ahaz, Yehizkiel, during Yehuda, who were the rulers of Yehuda. So he went through several generations of those rulers, as well as during the time of Yoravam, Ben Yoash, who was like the leader of Yisrael in the north. So basically, that's who we're focusing in on here. Now, later in the text, interesting enough, you see there's a part that's in a kind of a yellowish highlight. It says about this particular section, most of this, as I mentioned before, because Hoshea was a prophet prophesying mainly against the north, and he had some mentions of the south and Yehuda, but mainly he was prophesying against the northern kingdom of Yisrael. And in the highlighted section, it says in the text, "Wa'eth Beth Yehuda arachem, wa'hoshiatim, Babiloni Elohehem." And it continues, it says, "Walo Oshiam, Mekeshet Uvaharev, Uvil Milhomo, Basusim Uforoshim." So why is this important? Because initially when this text starts, it starts focusing on the northern kingdom, which we know, according to history, had walked away from the Torah a lot further than the southern kingdom of Yehuda did. So the northern kingdom of Yisrael had walked away from the Torah further than the tribes of Yehuda, the kingdom of Yehuda. And interestingly enough, right before the highlight part that I just mentioned, it basically mentions that Hashem would not have mercy on the northern kingdoms because of the things that they had done, the type of avodah zarah that they had done. But it says in the highlighted, "Ve'et Beth Yehuda arachem," which means that he would have mercy on Yehuda. So we've immediately just seen that this basically is a problem for the person who made this original claim. And the reason why this is a problem, because unlike the government in the northern kingdom, Hashem says he will have mercy for the southern kingdom, where earlier he had said he wouldn't have mercy, for the northern kingdom. And this kind of mercy meaning that basically what was going to happen was that the Assyrians would, invade, and the northern kingdoms were carried off by the Assyrians, and basically the whole government structure never came back. Now, that doesn't mean that they took away every single person in the Northern Kingdom. What it essentially meant was that they took the government over and then traded people in to kind of mix up the populations. And I think I mentioned this in a previous video, where in the Southern Kingdom of Yehuda, they were able to survive the Assyrian invasion because of the fact that the creator of all things, Hashem, protected them from it, because even though they had done some things incorrect in terms of the Torah, they hadn't fully abandoned it. And basically, even when the Babylonians did invade, the average person wasn't taken, it was just the government. And people were able to go back to doing Torah as normal, and the government eventually did come back. That didn't happen with the northern kingdoms, and to this day hasn't really happened. So this is an important message here, because what's interesting is the section after the highlighter that I read, where Hashem says that he would not deliver the tribes of Yehuda, or the southern kingdom of Yehuda, with with swords and war, and also with horses and like different things like that, like not with the implements of war, that they wouldn't be delivered in that way. Now, the person who, basically the Christian who basically caused me to do this video, if you will, he mentions a specific chapter and specific verses in the chapter. But the thing is, every place where I have highlighted here, you see that there's a huge focus on the northern kingdoms of Yisrael, because the first part in highlight says, "Shemul zot hakohanim v'hakshivu beth Yisrael." So basically, it's mentioning the Kohanim, like one of the focuses that's going to happen in this area, in this section, and it mentions Bet Yisrael, meaning the northern kingdoms. The next highlighted section, Ephraim Yisrael, meaning Ephraim was one of the names that the prophet used to describe the northern kingdoms, because Ephraim were the leaders of that kingdom. Then the next one, Ephraim Nitamu Yisrael. So he mentions Ephraim, and then mentions that the northern kingdom had basically become tameh, or basically was like not impure is one way they translated, but like it's just like saying ritually unfit. And then the next highlighted section, Yisrael Ephraim, Yikshalu ba'avonotham, Kashal Jam Yehuda Imam. So basically it mentions that Yisrael and Ephraim had basically failed and had done transgressions against the Torah, and that also Yehuda had done it, but because of the fact that it keeps mentioning Ephraim and Yisrael over and over again, it's obvious that Ephraim and Yehuda, the northern kingdoms, had done more, and that's one of the reasons when they were exiled, they didn't come back as a functional kingdom. And then, we continue, Ephraim, Lashama, Tiye, B'yom Tocho, B'shiftei Yisrael. So Ephraim is mentioned again, Yisrael is mentioned again. And it goes on and on. Oshuk Ephraim, Rotsu Mishpot. Ki Ho'il Holach Acharei Tzob. So basically, again, basically the people of Ephraim and the northern kingdom are being called the government specifically. And wani osh leEphraim. And again, Yehuda is mentioned here, but again, not as much as Ephraim is being mentioned. So the thing we get out of this is that basically the northern kingdoms were in error, and that's why they were able to. That's why they were exiled the way they were. Now, going into chapter 6, this is where it starts out in a very interesting manner, and this is where the point that the Christian who was brought up this topic was making is completely invalidated. In the first verse that's highlighted here in Aleph, which is like verse 1, it says, Lechu wa nashuvo el Adonai, ki hu toraf v'yirpe'enu, yach v'yach bishenu. So basically, the solution is given right here in this verse. The solution is to return to the Torah. This was Lachu nashuvu el Adonai, which means to return to Hashem, meaning return to doing the Torah correctly and not accepting avodah zarah, and not taking on foreign concepts. So basically, it says that Kihu Torah v'yirpa'enu. So he's basically the one when the people of the northern kingdom and also Yehuda had turned away from the Torah. He was the one who would cause or allow the situation to happen where they'd be conquered, but he could also repair it. So basically, the prophet's given the in Hebrew we say the pitoron, which means the solution. And then it says, like in the last part, a distinction is made. Gam Yehuda shoth katsir loch bashuvi bashuf ami. So basically, there's talk here that the tribes of Yehuda would see a return, where we don't see that for the northern kingdoms. There's a big difference that's being made between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. So basically, this basically throws out the whole point that the person was making. Their point was not supported here because of the fact that they don't take the whole context, and in their, I guess, their religion, they decide to look at one particular section and like ignore it, and they also look at it in translation, translated by people who have an agenda to make with the translation. So then going to the very end of the text, if you go to the highlighted part, starting with one that has like a kind of like a one in red on the right side, the last part says, Shuvu Yisrael ad Adonai Elohecha. So basically what we're saying here is that in Hoshea's prophecy, his nevuah, that the northern kingdom could have made a comeback if they had just returned to the Torah. We're not being told to do, a Christian thing to accept, a person as being, like a Messiah. We're not talked about, accepting someone who says that that they're a God or anything like that. None of that's being presented here. It's return to the Torah. Nothing new is presented. Just return to the Torah that you already had, which basically means that if they're being told to return, that they already had the Torah. It wasn't like a situation where the correct Torah and the correct understanding of it didn't exist. It's just a matter of they had, were starting to abandon it, and they were being told to return to it. So it means that it was available to them. And it continues, Kehu imachem davorim, washuvu al Adonai imru elov, kol tisa'awan v'kach tov, v'nez shalamo, forim safotenu. So basically the solution also given that basically returning to the creator of all things, in practice and also in word, that essentially that would repair the situation. And it goes on in the next highlighted section, Irpol meshovotham, or vem nedovom, ki shov api mimenu. So basically, if they return to the Torah that had been already given and to the practice of the Torah, this would repair the situation. That's what is being told here in this text. There's nothing here about accepting, the Christian concept of salvation and deliverance and all that kind of stuff, and of a dying Messiah. None of that stuff is here. It's basically you have all the tools to make the proper turnaround, and we know that the tribe of Yehuda made that turnaround and were saved because of it from the threats, the national threats that were there. And it says, going further, Yoshuvu Yosheve Bitsilo, Yahoyu Dohon, Yifrahu, Jofan, Zichuru Keyen Levonon. So basically, the benefits of returning in the way that the Torah that had already existed and the practice of the Torah that existed are compared to like beautiful things, of like having the resources that are necessary for life, if you will. And basically the things that make life enjoyable. So those things they basically return. Now it could have been the place where the prophet says, return and wait several thousand years for supposedly some guy to come and claim that he's like, the creator of all things, claim that he's a god or something like that. None of that's here. And the last particular line in the text says, Mi chacham yoven ele novon v'yedaim ki yeshorim darchei Adonai v'tzedikim yelachu v'om u'fojaim yikoshalu v'om. So basically, the conclusion that this prophet gives is that someone who has understanding and wisdom will understand what's being talked about here. They'll know. And they'll know that the path of Hashem is straight. And they'll know that basically those who are tzaddikim will walk in the ways of Hashem, but those who are against the ways of Hashem will fail. They will fail in whatever they're doing. So essentially, if what this person is saying is true, the Jewish nation would have failed. There'd be no Jews right now. There basically essentially would only be Christians at this point. There should be no Jews if what this person is saying is true. But what we do know is that in every situation, those who are of the kingdom of Yehudah survived. Even if the government was carried away, the government eventually did come back. Those who were descendants of those who were exiled came back, and those who were already living in the land of Israel, in the land of Yehudah, who were like of the regular people, were able to stay. Where you didn't have the type of destruction that the Syrians did. The Syrians came in, took the northern kingdom, took away the government, destroyed everybody who was descendants of the government, and then basically replaced people with like foreign people in order to separate the people from their land. And to this day, there's only certain groups of people who can potentially say that they're from the northern tribes, but there's a lot of people who are like unknown, if you will. So in summary, going back to what this person wrote, as they said, as for that, God says that Judah and Ephraim will be crushed in judgment. Okay, not really, until they acknowledge their guilt. Well, again, if you understand it from the English, that's not what's being talked about here. Returning to the Torah is what's being talked about. Acknowledging guilt doesn't mean anything if you don't actually do something. Actions are what speak louder than words here. And the person says at the time that they will be healed, but not until after 2 days. No, that's not what it says at all. What it says essentially is that at any time they could have made shuvah and returned. No amount of time is required to do that. If they make shuvah, if they make returns. But we saw in the text that there was a difference between how the kingdom of Yehudah and how the northern kingdoms of Ephraim and of Yisrael were being treated. They're talked about in completely different terms because, again, the prophet was from the northern tribes. So he himself was speaking to predominantly the people that were in the region he was from. So what we can say from this is that this particular person who wrote this is wrong, and that they are not basing it on what's in the text because again they ignore everything in the text and focusing on one particular verses from a Christian Bible in English. So again, this is Ahav Ever from the Chronicles of Ahav Ever, and I hope this has helped. Take care.